Glad you're here. If you have your Bible or your phone, go to Luke 23. Good to see the balcony crew up there. I want to ask you a question. What is it that comes to your mind when you hear the word comeback? Now, there's perfect timing. Maybe you think of a game where your favorite team, just was behind, and then somehow they made a miraculous comeback and won the game, maybe on a last-second shot or a hit in the bottom of the ninth inning. Or maybe your mind goes to a person rather than a game. If you're a baseball fan, you might have thought of this guy. I want to show you a picture. This is Josh Hamilton. And a couple of weeks ago, on August the 16th, Josh Hamilton was inducted into the Texas Rangers Hall of Fame, which is really a huge honor considering he only played for the Rangers for a total of 5 seasons. Now, if you're familiar with his career at all, then you know that Josh Hamilton was a great baseball player. But there are a lot of great baseball players. What makes his story so compelling are the dramatic ups and downs that he endured to get to that point. A headline from the Dallas Morning News put it like this: Josh Hamilton's enshrinement in Rangers Hall of Fame was a time of reflection, regret, and one last ovation. Coming out of high school, Josh Hamilton was considered to be one of the top 2 professional baseball prospects in America. He was the kind of player that most scouts dream about one day finding. He could hit for average, he had power to hit it out of the park, he was good with the glove, and he had uncommon speed. He was a complete player. In fact, he was so good coming out of high school that he decided to skip college altogether, and in 1999, he was the number 1 pick in Major League Baseball's draft, earning him a signing bonus of nearly $4 million. Now, at that point, it was assumed that he would go on to have a great career. He was, a lot of people tapped him to be baseball's next big star. As time went on, he quickly worked his way up through the minor leagues until sometime in 2001, when he was on his way home from a spring training game, he was involved in a terrible automobile accident. Now, like a lot of people that go through accidents, he immediately started physical therapy, but at the same time, he also developed an addiction to painkillers. He kept taking more and more painkillers, trying to ease the discomfort. At the same time he was taking the painkillers, he also started drinking very heavily. And as often happens from there, it was a downward spiral. It wasn't long until he was drinking way too much, taking way too many painkillers, and even progressed to taking some harder drugs. Now, as often happens for people in that situation, he would disappear for weeks at a time with nobody knowing where he was. Finally, after several months of that, his team, the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, even though they had a lot invested in him, decided to cut their losses, and they cut him from the team. So here he was, 2 years into what was expected to be a Hall of Fame career, unemployed, broke, he'd blown through all the money, and without much hope for the future. Now, fast forward 4 years into the future, October 1st, 2005. On that afternoon, Josh Hamilton, after not being seen for months, staggered up the steps of his grandmother's home in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was dirty, he hadn't eaten in a few days, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, homeless, and without any money in his pocket. Now, at that point, his grandmother had a decision to make. She could kick him out, tell him to get lost, or she can invite him in. And she chose to invite him in, where she fed him and gave him a place to stay for several nights until he could figure out what was next. The other thing she did, though, is she gave him a copy of a Bible, and by his own admission, he was pretty resistant to that. But after a few days and his head began to clear up, he thought it wouldn't hurt anything, so he opened the Bible, and when he did, his eyes were immediately drawn to one verse in James chapter 4. Here's what it says: "Humble yourself before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Now, looking back on his experience, he said this in a recent interview. He said there were a lot of bottoms. They just kept going deeper and deeper. It's a vicious cycle. You think, okay, I've reached the bottom, but actually you haven't. You can always go lower to the point of death. You ever been there? You ever been so low, you kind of hit rock bottom that the only thing left is for you to die? That's where he was. But listen to how he explained what happened when he first read that verse from James. He said, "It grabbed my insides. My eyes watered up. I got on my knees and started talking to the Lord. Emotionally, spiritually, physically, I felt hopeless." But then he added this: "But when you feel the most hopeless, You're the most willing to do whatever it takes. That was my moment of surrender. Now, if you know the rest of the story, then you know that that really was a life-altering moment for Josh Hamilton. He immediately entered an intensive drug rehab program, and in 2006, just 1 year later, he was offered a contract by the Cincinnati Reds. By 2007, he was playing for the Texas Rangers, and the rest is history. 5-time All-Star, batting champion, Silver Slugger Award winner, RBI leader, and in 2010, he was named the most valuable player in the American League. Today, he's retired and considers himself a full-time dad to his 3 teenage daughters, but by his own admission, his life has kind of been like a roller coaster. There's been a lot of ups, and there's been some pretty dramatic downs. I want you to listen to how he closed his Hall of Fame induction speech a couple weeks ago. Here's what he said. My life wouldn't be what it is if I hadn't asked for Jesus' help. When you look at my career, it's clear when I was asking for and getting God's guidance and when I wasn't. I don't know about you, but I love stories like that. A once-in-a-lifetime baseball player throws his career away, wrecks his life, only to come back and accomplish what few people ever dream of accomplishing. A business that was once on the verge of bankruptcy makes a few key changes, and now they come back more profitable than ever. A school with low test scores and low morale gets a new leader, and all of a sudden it's like the light comes on and everything is different. A church that was once struggling to survive decides to turn their focus off themselves and do the things that Jesus actually told them to do, and all of a sudden, instead of trying to survive, they're thriving. Or a family that at one point was literally coming apart at the seams becomes a model of what it means to love each other deeply. There's just something about a comeback story that inspires us, that draws us in, and gives us hope that in the future, things really could be different than they are now. One writer said it like this: every classic comeback story contains one of two twists. It's either about an underdog who falters and then succeeds beyond his dreams, or it's about a champion who falls, fights hard, and makes a big return. This morning, we're kicking off a new series we've been talking about for several weeks called The Comeback. And the idea behind it is that each of us in different areas of our lives have at least one area where we need to experience a comeback. And it could be anything. Maybe for you, it's a strained relationship. Maybe it's a financial problem, a family problem. Maybe your work situation is uncertain, or maybe you're just feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Or maybe like Josh Hamilton, you're struggling with some sort of an addiction. Or it could be a combination of several of those things. But for some of you, it could be something else entirely. It could be that in your past, maybe even in your recent past, you've made a big mistake, or maybe you've made a whole series of bad decisions. And now you're at a place in life where you have to begin picking up the pieces. And if that's you, I want you to know there's hope. If you have your Bible or your phone open to Luke 23, this morning, we're going to look at my favorite story in the Bible. In fact, I would preach on this every Sunday if I didn't think you would get tired of hearing it and stop coming. Because this is the kind of story, I could talk about this a lot longer than you'd be interested in listening about this. But before we jump in, there's one key truth that I want you to understand before we jump into this that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks, and it's this. Every setback is a setup for a comeback. Make sure you understand that. Every setback is a setup for a comeback. The reason they're called comebacks is because in order to experience a comeback, there first has to be a setback. I mean, in order to get up when life knocks you down, you first have to be knocked down. That's the part we don't enjoy all that much, but in order for there to be a comeback, there first has to be a setback. So here's my warning to you. If life has never knocked you down, if you've never made any mistakes, if everything in your life is just going great and there's nothing that you look at and say, boy, I really need to experience a comeback, then the next few weeks do not apply to you. But my suspicion is that if you were honest, you would have to admit there's at least one area of your life where you need a comeback. I don't have to know what it is, but my suspicion is that you know very much what it is. And if that's your situation, I hope you'll stick with us over the next few weeks. Because here's the deal. Comebacks are hard to come by. You know what I mean? They're not easy. So how do you experience a comeback? What you find in Luke 23 is Luke's portrait of this incredible scene that takes place at the end of Jesus' life on earth. In verse 32, as we pick up the story, Jesus has been arrested, he's been convicted, and he's been sentenced to death. He's now in the final moments of his earthly life as he hangs on a Roman cross, but in a surprising twist, he's not there alone. Now, in those days, crucifixions were designed to be as public as possible. You might think about it like a hanging in an Old West town. The crowd would show up anytime there was a crucifixion, and the Romans loved that because it was their opportunity to send a message to everybody in that area that you did not mess with Rome. But in this particular instance, not only is there this large crowd of spectators who've gathered to watch this, Luke also tells us that on either side of Jesus, there are these two well-known criminals who are being crucified with Jesus. Here's the way Luke tells the story, Luke 23, verse 32. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." Now, as I said, crucifixion, meant to be a public event, it was designed to inflict as much psychological or maybe even more psychological pain than it did physical pain. And in this particular event, the crowd that is gathered are not just there as spectators, they're active participants. Just days before, if you know the story, they had lined the streets and they cheered Jesus as he came into town. They welcomed him as a king. And now just a week later, they've turned on him and they followed the example of their leaders. And in the final moments of Jesus' earthly life, they begin hurling insults at him and relentlessly trash-talking him. And the way a crucifixion would work is the Roman soldiers would take your body, they would take these long spikes, and they would nail you to a wooden cross through your hands and through your feet. And then as you hung there, the weight of your body would cause your chest to sag, eventually putting a lot of pressure on your lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. From time to time, the condemned person would muster their strength. They'd push up off their feet, and they would raise their chest just long enough for them to capture a breath before having to lower themselves back down because of the excruciating pain coursing through their body. As the day went on, the person would eventually weaken. It would become impossible for them to push themselves up, and eventually they would suffocate. Now, for most people, it was a matter of hours. Some people would last into the next day, but by all accounts, it was a brutal way to die. And as Jesus hangs there, the Romans have also very intentionally crucified him alongside these two well-known criminals as their way of communicating to the people, hey, you may have thought Jesus was something special. You may have thought he was the Messiah, but we've proven to you he's just a common criminal. He's just another false Messiah in a long line of false messiahs, complete with all the empty promises. And the truth is, we don't know much about these two guys that were crucified with Jesus. We don't even really know what their crimes were. But it's safe to say these two guys were well known. Probably safe to say their stories were very ugly and very public. I mean, everybody could look at them and they knew exactly what they'd done. The other thing I think it's safe to say, though, is that for these two guys, this was not what they planned. I mean, when they were little kids, they were dreaming about what their life was going to be like. I doubt they thought to themselves, hey, wouldn't it be great like if I lived a terrible life and then I wound up getting publicly executed in front of a bunch of people? I mean, this is probably not what they dreamed about. In fact, as Matthew's telling the story, as the day opens, he tells us that both of these criminals on both sides of Jesus, as the day began, they joined in with the crowd, they joined in with the rulers, and they were piling on the insults toward Jesus. But then the strangest thing happens. As the day drags on, the morning turns to afternoon, one of these criminals experiences a dramatic change of heart. I want you to look at what Luke says next in verse 39. One of the criminals there, who hung there, hurled insults at him, talking about Jesus. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Now keep in mind, here's this guy, he's in what he knows are the final hours of his life on earth, and what's he doing? He's letting his bitterness and his anger and his rage just spill out. And to be honest, I wish we knew more about him, but as I said, I'm sure like when he was a kid, this is not what he dreamed about. He probably had the same dreams that everybody else has. Going to grow up, be a businessman, make a lot of money, get married, have a bunch of kids and live happily ever after. But somewhere along the line, his life took a wrong turn, and we don't know what it was. Maybe he got desperate and he stole something. Maybe he fell in with the wrong crowd. Maybe it was something that happened to him, a job loss, an unexpected divorce, some sort of a personal tragedy, and he took a wrong turn and got caught up in some stuff and was in over his head. Whatever it was that happened, though, in the final moments of his life, he's angry and he's lashing out. Now, you've heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And that's what this guy is doing. He's come to the final moments of his life. He's angry. He's hurting. He's a little bit scared. And he decides to go out of this life just like he lived this life. And he's going to hurt as many people as possible. Now contrast that with the other criminal. Verse 40. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said. Since you're under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. My favorite story in the Bible. In one incredible moment, this guilty criminal goes from desperate and hopeless to hopeful and secure. And what you're going to see in the course of just 2 verses, a very brief summary of a much longer conversation, I'm sure, is the first steps to a comeback. Every comeback story is a journey, and there's always a first step. If you're keeping track on your outline, here's the first thing you have to do in order to experience a comeback. You have to accept responsibility. A couple weeks ago, I read a news story about a 57-year-old man in New Jersey named Alexander Goldinsky. I want to show you this picture. You may have seen this on the news. Last September, Mr. Goldinsky was at the company. He was in the break room of the company where he works. It was break time. He walked over to the soda machine, which you can just barely see in the picture. He grabbed a cup, just like we always do, and he stuck it, and he filled this cup up with ice. It was then that the story takes a dramatic turn, because rather than filling up his cup with soda, he turned around on the floor and he proceeded to pour out the ice all over the floor where he was standing. He then took a walk for about 10 feet before abruptly turning back around, coming right back to where he'd been standing in the midst of all these ice cubes on the floor. He grabbed the counter next to him and then slowly lowered himself down to where he was laying on top of the ice cubes. It was then that he let out a holler for his coworkers to come, and he told them he'd had a nasty spill and they needed to call an ambulance because he'd slipped on the ice. What he didn't know was that his company had installed these sort of hidden security cameras that captured the whole thing in high definition. Now, his company waited to see what he was going to do, and sure enough, a few days later, he filed a lawsuit against his employer for unsafe working conditions or something like that. And it was then that his employers released the tape and showed him that they had everything that had happened on video. Now you would think that for a normal person, that would be the end of it, right? It's okay, hey, I didn't mean it. Sorry, let's forget this ever happened. But not Mr. Goldinsky. He continued with his lawsuit. In fact, he even filed an insurance claim, which got him charged with insurance fraud. In fact, what makes it even more incredible, back in February of this year, during his first court appearance, the prosecutors played the tape, and after he watched the tape in open court, he still pled not guilty. This went on for several months until August 16th, just a couple weeks ago, when Mr. Goldinsky's attorneys finally convinced him that he did not have a winning case, he needed to plead guilty to the insurance fraud, pay a fine, and he accepted the terms of his probation. Now, I don't know how to explain that, except to say we've all done that. Here's what I mean by that. There have been times when you know you're guilty, and everybody else knows you're guilty, and maybe it's not on video, but you know and they know, and you still act like you're not guilty. Anybody ever done that? There's just something about us, something deep within us, that even when we're guilty of something, we don't like to admit it. There's something within us that rebels against accepting responsibility for the things we've done and the messes that we've made. And thankfully, at least one of the criminals that was crucified next to Jesus refused to play that game. As he hung there in excruciating pain, fighting what he knew would be a losing battle for his life, in a moment of clarity, he admitted his guilt before God and he accepted responsibility for the wrong that he had done. Can I just tell you that one of the quickest ways to prevent yourself from experiencing a comeback in your own life is to refuse to accept responsibility for what's happened? I mean, one of the things that will hold you back, will hold you hostage, will keep you from moving forward is refusing to accept the responsibility for what you've done. And don't get me wrong, what's happened to you may not be all your fault. In fact, very little of it may be your fault. It could be that a lot of the things that you're dealing with, a lot of the things that are holding you back are out of your control. But whatever's happened in the past, only you have the power to create a better future. Only you have the power to write a better story. And you can only do that when you admit and accept responsibility for what you've done. The New Testament has a word for it. It's called repentance. And it literally means you're changing direction. So I was walking this direction, and I realized this direction is not working, so I'm going to change direction. I'm going to admit where I was wrong, and I'm going to walk in a new direction. Here's the deal. Only you can make that decision. Nobody can do it for you. Here's the second thing. You accept responsibility, and then you turn to Jesus. Look at verse 40 again. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God, he said, since you're under the same sentence. We are punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then check this out. Verse 42. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. For the thief on the cross, turning to Jesus, took the form of a very simple 9-word prayer. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now, we don't really know all that led up to that moment. Maybe this thief had already heard Jesus teach. At the very least, he knew some things about Jesus because everybody in that area had heard some things about Jesus. But now, as he hung there just a few feet from Jesus on what was the worst day of his life and what would prove to be the last day of his earthly life, it finally hit him. He had nowhere else to turn. All of his options were exhausted, and now he knew that his only hope was the guy hanging on the cross just a few feet from him. And it could be for some of you here this morning, you've exhausted all your options too. You're not hanging on a cross, but maybe you feel like you're at rock bottom. And maybe for the last few years, maybe the last few months, maybe the last few weeks, you've tried everything you know to solve your own problems. And yet here they are, bigger than they've ever been. And maybe just like this guy, you know some stuff about Jesus. Maybe you went to church when you were a kid, or Bible school or VBS. Maybe your grandma read you the Bible stories right before you took your nap. I mean, maybe you know some stuff about Jesus, but for whatever reason, you've never put your trust in Jesus. You've never put your life in his hands. And if that's your situation, I want to encourage you. Do it today. Because here's the deal. If you could solve your own problem, you'd have already solved it. If I could solve my own problems, I'd have already solved them. Deep down inside, you know you can't do it on your own. Paul said it like this. He said, all of us have sinned. All of us fall short. We're all in the same boat. None of us can solve our own problems. We all need to experience a comeback. And the only way possible is through Jesus. And what I want you to understand from this story is that turning to Jesus is not as complicated as we sometimes make it. For the thief on the cross, it wasn't complicated at all. It was as simple as admitting his mistakes, accepting responsibility, admitting his guilt, and then offering a 9-word prayer to Jesus. That was all it took. No background checks, no in-depth interview, no paperwork to fill out. Jesus didn't say, hey, come back in a day or two after we run your criminal history and we check your credit score. He didn't have to pass a theology quiz, and nobody had to vote on whether or not to accept him as a member. The only thing that mattered was he put his trust in Christ, and then Christ, in that incredible moment, My favorite part of the story, turns back around and makes him this promise. He says, today, and in fact, probably in a few minutes, you're going to be with me in paradise. I love the way J.D. Greear put this. He said, the thief on the cross made a crazy request. The only thing crazier is that Jesus granted it. I mean, here's this guy, lived a terrible life. I mean, there's nothing on his resume to make you think this guy's a candidate for God's grace. There's nothing he could do to earn his way on the team. And yet just because of his childlike faith in Jesus, Jesus turns around and says, hey man, don't you worry about it, because today we're going to paradise. 3 men died that day. 2 of them went to paradise. Now, if you're keeping track on your outline, there's one more thing. You accept responsibility, you put your trust in Jesus, and then you move forward with Jesus. For the thief on the cross, the end was in sight. For him, it would only be a matter of hours, maybe a matter of minutes. For you, you might have years to go, and I hope you do. But here's the deal. No matter how much time you have left, that clock is always ticking. You are always inching towards the finish line. And no matter what, you're always moving forward. You can't stop the progress. You're always moving forward. The only question is you're either moving forward with Jesus or you're moving forward without Jesus. As many of you know, the last week has been extremely difficult for our family. Last Tuesday, September 3rd, Jamie's dad was walking into a meeting at his job when he collapsed. Unfortunately, the paramedics were unable to revive him, and that was it. Now, if you've talked to Jamie, then you know the last 6 months of her dad's life have been pretty eventful. I've got a picture I want to show you that was taken a couple years ago. Back in March, for the first time in his life, he found himself between jobs. He had a high-ranking corporate job. A company took a downturn. Some people got laid off. And he found himself without a job for the first time in his life. Now, you know, everybody handles that differently, but when you've had a pretty long and successful career, that's a tough pill to swallow. The great thing was, though, during those months at home, he had an opportunity to do some things that he didn't normally get to do because of his job. One of those things was our men's retreat back in Dale Hollow in May. If you were there in the discussion groups, you might remember he was very open about some of the things he was going through. Some days after that men's retreat, he went home, and I sent him a book, and the title of the book was The Comeback. It was written by Louis Giglio. It's where we got the idea for this sermon series. Now, the sermons are mine, but the theme was his. When he got the book, he started reading it, and by his own admission, he read it twice the first week. And during that time, every day or two, he'd send me a text about, here's what I'm learning, here's what I'm reading. The same time, since he was home on the weekends and not traveling for his job, he was able to go to church with his family almost every week. Then he would go home and he'd watch the live stream, the replay in the afternoon from Arsa. In fact, he told Jamie that a lot of times he would watch it twice. You think it's bad listening once? Just imagine listening twice. Now, I've known Scott for a long time. And I can tell you that the last 5 months, and specifically the last 3 months, he was in a better place spiritually than I'd ever seen him. The conversations were better, more focused, deeper than anything I can remember. So I went back this week and I reread some of the text messages in preparing for the funeral. And I found this one that he wrote me just in the midst of all reading this book. He said, "It's been tough, but I'm learning to do a better job relaxing and listening." And I knew what he meant. And you do too. Sometimes when you're in the day-to-day grind of trying to build your life and build your career, you lose perspective. And what you think is the most important is not the most important, and instead the most important things sort of get pushed to the margins. That's what we do. All of us are guilty. But every once in a while something happens and it refocuses you. And you start to realize what really matters. Now, nobody could have imagined what would happen just a few weeks into his new job, but looking back on it, it's clear that those 4 months he had at home were more valuable than anything anybody could imagine. The chance to spend time with his family and refocus on his spiritual life. And what looked like a terrible setback proved to be a greater comeback. And for some of you here today, I don't have any idea what you're going through. But I know that life is sometimes really hard. And I know sometimes it beats you down. And if that's where you're at today, I want you to know you can experience a comeback, but it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what you've done. Doesn't matter how far you've drifted. Doesn't matter how many wrong turns you've taken. You're never too far away from God's grace. I love the way one writer put it. He said, whatever our individual story is, our story joins a larger story, a story of people who stumbled and fallen, a story of people whose lives were messy, a story of people whose lives were broken and confused, and yet they were invited to experience the ocean of God's love. That same invitation is open for everybody. But I got to be totally honest with you. One of the things we've been saying a lot leading up to this series, and you've heard us say this in all these videos, is that it's never too late and you're never too far. And you know what that means. I mean, you get the truth of that statement. It means you get to the final hours of your life that God's grace can extend to you no matter how far away you've drifted. And it communicates a powerful truth. But I got to be honest with you and tell you, it's not totally accurate. It's not. As I said a minute ago, there were 3 men who died that day. 2 of them went to paradise. That's the part of the story we like. But it wasn't all 3 of them. Make sure you understand. Even though one of those criminals understood and he chose to turn to Christ, the other guy never came around. I mean, he chose to go out exactly like he lived his life, and we don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was that afternoon. Maybe he survived into the next day. But one thing we know for sure, there came a moment when he took his last breath and his heart beat for the last time. And at that moment, it was too late. There was no turning back. And here's the deal. That same moment happens to everybody. Sometimes it comes at the end of a long illness when you're old and tired. And sometimes it comes at an unexpected moment that nobody saw coming. And when that moment comes and you transition from this life to the next, I want you to know when that moment hits, it's too late. There's no turning back. So if you're here and you need a fresh start, I'm going to tell you, you're never too far. No matter what you've done, no matter how many wrong turns you've made, how far you drifted, you're never too far. But you can be too late. So if you're here and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, don't wait. I want you to stand. We're going to have what we call an invitation, and we're going to stand and we're going to sing a song together. And if you need to pray with somebody or you feel the Holy Spirit calling you to make a decision, we invite you to come. David and I will be here. You just meet us on this front row. Others of you may be here and you're doing okay, but you're worried about some people that you love. Today would be a great opportunity for you to pray for them. If you need to talk to somebody, pray with somebody, you just come meet us on this front row.